What happens when data meets science and patient care? Is AI today ready to disrupt? Where are we going? Our leading experts bring diverse perspectives on the power and promise of technological innovations, especially as they relate to drug development, clinical trials, and healthcare delivery. Please welcome Vinita Agarwala, General Partner, Andreessen Horowitz, Rohit Chandra, Chief Digital Officer, Cleveland Clinic, Daphne Kohler, CEO and Founder, Incitro, and Ben Robbins, Venture Partner, GV.
Welcome, everybody. We have the broad topic of discussing healthcare and technology, which I think we will narrow slightly into precision medicine, especially as it relates to drug development and clinical trials, as well as healthcare delivery. So my first question, can start with Daphne. Very curious, do you see novel data sources being used within clinical trials in the last couple of years?
I think of the use of data and machine learning and AI tools as being sort of such a core technology that the best analogy that I come up with when people say, well, are we going to end up, where's machine learning or AI going to make a difference in the entire value chain? And my analogy is that it's like asking where a computer is going to make a difference in the entire value chain. It's such a fundamental tool that it's going to make a difference anywhere. It's not going to be one big monolithic system in the sense that we're not running all of the computational aspects of anything that we do on a single big mainframe system. It's a bunch of different applications, and machine learning just makes all of them better. And so I think we're going to see the use of machine learning and AI tools in every single part of everything from identifying targets to designing compounds, to identifying patient populations, to tracking their progression, to figuring out ultimately at the end of the day which patients we want to prescribe drugs to in the field. And it's not going to be a single monolithic whole.
And maybe I could just chime in, Ben, with a real example, since I find that those help people on these panels. But I totally agree with Daphne. The use of technology is going to happen at every single step of drug development. But in clinical trial design, I'd point folks to what I thought was an exciting paper from James Zhao's lab at Stanford on evaluating, in real-world data sets, what the impact of changing clinical trial eligibility criteria would be for oncology clinical trials. And so the group asked a really interesting question and said, let's take a very large database of real-world patients who have a relatively common cancer type, in this case, non-small cell lung cancer, and let's rerun, in a sense, using real-world treatment responses, admittedly, not clinical trial regulated responses, clinical trials. And let's ask, if we had run the clinical trial using the criteria that the sponsor used to run a trial, who would have been eligible? Let's try tweaking the clinical trial eligibility criteria. Let's open it up a little bit. Let's make it eligible for patients who might have been excluded for reasons related to their lab values or their age or their age at diagnosis, or all kinds of criteria that we use today to restrict patients' access to clinical trials. And they came to some really interesting conclusions that maybe our perceived sensitivity or our estimated effect of modulating clinical trial inclusion criteria might be larger than it really is, and found that maybe we could have been more lenient in including patients in clinical trials. And that also gets to the matter of of equitability of access to care and access to clinical trials, which in oncology, of course, clinical trials are the NCCN recommended treatment for many cancer types. And so it's a really compelling implication, which is that potentially clinical trials could be far more inclusive. It's a conclusion that we can deploy prospectively with the support of data like this and analysis like this that gives us confidence and comfort in undertaking a very, very expensive clinical trial, potentially in a different way in the future. And so I thought that was a really nice example. It's a paper called Evaluating Eligibility Criteria of Oncology Trials Using Real-World Data and AI, published in Nature last year.
So I was just going to add that in addition to identifying patients in a more robust and data-driven way, the other major place where machine learning can really help in clinical trials is also in endpoint ascertainment. A lot of times we are using fairly subjective and highly noisy measurements for identifying whether a patient is or is not responding to the treatment. This is an issue in a lot of different indications. Some of the work that we did with Gilead in NASH, the kind of machine learned endpoints that we were able to extract from the histopathology data are much finer grained and are able to empower trials in a whole new way to identify whether patients are in fact responding to treatment, even in the course of a fairly short trial. I think that delta is even more important in areas where the responses are intrinsically subjective, such as in neuroscience indications where you're reliant on patient or caregiver questionnaires or cognitive tests that are delivered in a very artificial setting where the patient is under stress, trying really hard to perform well, which is why we see such a huge placebo effect as well. So the more you're able to construct robust data-driven endpoints for determining whether a patient is actually responding to treatment, the better we'll be able to empower clinical trials. And that's particularly important when you're doing some of the smaller indications or smaller trial arms in in phase 2, for example, where we often don't know how to interpret the data given the huge error bars that are driven from the fairly noisy high variance endpoints that we're currently using. So that's the other place.
Rohit, super curious. So we're seeing a lot of discussion of the role of novel data sources, novel data analytics in the world of drug development. We're also hearing a lot of talk of the ability to either create algorithmic care or predictive care in the hospital setting. Really curious if you're seeing real on the ground evidence that we're progressing towards a world where there's algorithmic or predictive analytics being integrated into care.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that the high level comment I would make is that there's a lot of enthusiasm that I see for leveraging analytics in literally every aspect of the day-to-day clinical care that we provide. And just to pick a little bit on the thread that Vinita and Daphne alluded to, it requires deep collaboration. And I think that that's the thread that I see. In fact, the failure mode that I often encounter, and we're working hard to overcome that, is it's not going to be solved by technology alone, and it's not going to be solved by a physician alone. And the question is, if we can understand and leverage the clinical expertise and then marry that to what technology can help in assisting it, I think that's sort of the winning formula. And I don't think we've cracked it yet, but I think that we have to approach it with that mindset. If you take anesthesia, so the head of anesthesia is looking at, let's say, hundreds of cases, and some cases are complex and require sophisticated planning for anesthesia, and you need to make sure you have a highly experienced anesthesiologist. And there are other patients who are much simpler, where the procedure is relatively straightforward. Today, a physician has to go through hundreds of cases, look at each of the chart one by one to figure out how to have which anesthesiologist match to each physician. And examples like this are across the board. And a lot of it could be as simple as encoding the right set of rules that the physician has oversight and confidence in. A lot of it could be analytics, because eventually there are judgments that are being made. Would I entirely trust an algorithm? Probably not today, but there's no question that there are algorithms that can do a good to great to eventually excellent job. And what that does is, for a physician, is they're spending their time on the place where their expertise is needed the most, as opposed to sort of the busy work that a computer can offload for them. Similar examples are physicians have particular specialties. They want to spend their time on the patients that need their capability the most, having algorithms where, you can look at, what are the sort of symptoms and ailments that particular patients have, matching them to the right physician. Again, is an issue. And at the scale at which we do it, we have like 25 to 30,000 encounters per day. And trying to, if you can get 5, 10, 15, 20%, it frees up that much of a physician's time to leverage their expertise in the areas that matter the most. So operationally, I would say there's a lot of enthusiasm. It does require us to leverage the deep expertise from what an algorithm can and cannot do, and to leverage it wisely. But I think the opportunity and enthusiasm is absolutely there.
Are there particular clinical areas that you find most interesting? ICU, cancer care?
I would say that it is by and large across the board. The main part where I would say, whether it's pathology, whether it's anesthesiology, whether it's cancer, in all of these areas, there are different facets. In some places, it's streamlining physician time. In some places, it's just understanding, it's just sort of making sure your attention is going on the highest risk patients. So there's a prediction inside of the patients and sort of the likelihood of getting an infection. I would say another area which is a topic of, we're very sort of patient experience and patient safety focused. So we have a top priority for us is to sort of minimize, if not eliminate, hospital-acquired infections. And that is an area where you can, depending on patients, have predictions of which patients are more susceptible to a hospital-acquired infection, and can you drive that down to zero? You can be proactive about sort of taking care of those patients with that in mind. So that's another area where the opportunity is there, but it's not something that you can just show up and slap things together. You just have to go deep to really solve the problem.
Super interesting. When I think of just like the classic, the Gartner hype cycle, if people know what that is, where you start with, you're at the origin down here, and then you get overhyped, and then you go down, end up with that plateau in the middle. Where are we right now with ML? Are we peaked? Are we somewhere in equilibrium?
I think we're in a good part of the curve where people are starting to see just enough examples that are quite compelling and that seem quite reasonable, and where the problem statement has also come into focus. Daphne mentioned endpoints that are difficult to, it's hard to believe that's the best endpoint we have in some cases. I think about patients who are receiving CAR T therapies in the real world. We walk into their room every morning and we ask them to pen a sentence. Like, that's part of what we do, right? And it's that all these endpoints that we use both in trials and in real world practice seem very ripe and ready for change. And I think we're starting to see evidence. We meet with startups all the time, right? You and I, Ben, who are developing algorithms and, in the digital health world that seem reasonable, that seem like they work, that are validated in real patient populations. And so I do think I'm in an optimistic side of the curve where maybe we had gone through a overhyped cycle, but I think now we're starting to see real examples that could really change the game.
Unfortunately, I think from the perspective of the hype cycle for drug discovery and development more broadly, we're still on the ascending side of the hype cycle. And I find that to be particularly disconcerting because I've lived through several AI winters as a longtime machine learning AI researcher, and I've seen the damage that they cause to the field, where people suddenly realize that the extravagant promises that have been made are not yet being met. And what I really worry about in the context of the particular stage that we're at is that I worry that it could be damaging despite the fact that we're finally in a world where the machine learning technology can actually deliver considerable, huge amounts of value. But yet some of the promises that are made, the hyperbolic ones of we will have 1,000 drugs in the clinic in 3 years. I mean, you're not. It's just not going to happen. This is a really hard business. And if you make promises like that, then people discredit the field as a whole. So I think we're finally at a point where we can make reasonable I think, optimistic predictions that are still very compelling, but don't go all the way into the hyperbolic hype. And I would urge all of the people in this field to try and do that, and not sort of go into the hyperbole that is going to lead to inevitable skepticism and downstream disappointed. What the field can deliver is good enough, so let's just stick with that. It's pretty impressive, as some of the examples that Vinita mentioned and others have shown.
Super interesting. So a plea to get off the hype cycle. Don't let it go all the way to
yes.
Not only make the efficiency promises that Daphne's talking about, but also to not claim that the technology alone will produce the drug. Like, I think one of the things that's, from my perspective, it sounds trite and simple, but one of the things holding the field back is that people have tried to make claims that, there will be a drug that is developed purely through machine learning. Like, that makes nobody knows what that means. That's been confusing to decipher and untangle, and that's resulted in a lot of skepticism from people who know that's not possible. And that, I think that created an unnecessary cycle of conversation almost, versus what Daphne and others are doing, which is to say, we will sprinkle technology through every single step of the process, make every single step a little more efficient, increase our overall probability to success, hopefully, and just take a much more integrated approach to it.
I love that comment, Vinita. And so clearly there's going to be places where the computer produces some output, it's evaluated by a human, another set of experiments is designed, the machine maybe helps interpret those, but it's going to be this collaboration, this interplay between a machine and a human. So what does it mean to be a machine learning discovered drug? I mean, I can't even define that concept. So, I mean, the machines can make a significant, hopefully increasingly significant contribution to that process, but it's still, for many years to come, decades, going to be a collaboration between multiple machine learning modules and human beings that help design experiments, produce data, interpret the outputs of the machine learning, and so on. So thank you, Vinita, for highlighting that.
One observation I have in clinical practice is that I think we have been chasing examples or use cases to some extent where we could potentially replace what the clinician does with a predictive algorithm. And so for that reason, everybody has Google Photos in their mind, and everybody knows that machine learning is maybe best tried in the context of an image and, image classification with labels associated with those images. And so pathology and radiology have come to mind. And if you ask most people, hey, where is ML or technology going to really transform care delivery? People tend to give those examples. And I think they tend to give those examples for the wrong reasons, which is that we have assumed that the reason those places and those fields will have adoption is that we can take out somehow the radiologist or the pathologist, or have a machine kind of do that job, or squeeze out 20-30% efficiency, or whatever it may be. But that's actually not very exciting, because we want those people involved in deploying their expertise in analyzing those images. And 20-30% efficiency gain kind of isn't like the big goal. It doesn't seem like it would really change patient outcomes. And so I still think those are, in fact, indeed, fields that are ripe for machine learning, but for a very different reason, which is that you should be able to do something that the human could never have done. And I think, like, as a clinician, that's what I would want ML to do for me, not like increase my efficiency marginally, but give me an insight that there's just no way that my little brain, no matter how many years I've practiced, right, would be able to find that insight. That could be, nucleus morphology that in a set of features that combined actually do predict a patient's likelihood of responding to a therapy in a way that no one pathologist could know. That could be detecting sepsis early on an inpatient ward based on the amalgamation of 80 data points that are likely to be more informative than my intuition as a clinician. Like, these are all examples that are much more compelling, because they're not about juicing out a little bit of efficiency. They're about doing something the human team could not have done alone. And I think that's a much more exciting framing. that we're starting to see evidence of for the deployment of this technology in care delivery. And it's also one that I can genuinely say excites clinicians because it's no longer about trying to remove them, but it's about trying to augment, enable, and extend their capabilities.
You're exactly right. I think that there's opportunities at multiple points on the spectrum, and sort of organizationally, one of the things that I think about are in some disciplines and some physicians, they're looking for sort of that order of magnitude improvement and sort of the unique and new things. And then there's the part that I guess I wouldn't downplay is healthcare institutions are still, relatively speaking, in the early stages of leveraging these technologies. So when you want to deploy them in an operational setting, depending on the context, in some ways you want to crawl, walk, run. You want to show the benefits and then build on it. And so I actually see opportunities at multiple ends of the spectrum. But you're right. I mean, I think that there are big wins to be had if we are big and bold about leveraging these capabilities.
I think it's interesting because I think what you're describing is that we're essentially raising the bar for the best care possible for a given patient. The other place that I see people talking a lot, and seems to be mostly talk is what I see, and I'm very curious, Rohit, if you're seeing this in action, is that rather than necessarily raising the top level of care, is to take what we currently have as like good care and disseminating that knowledge out into the community.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that there's new things that we can do with technology, but we have a additional imperative, which is, I'll just say operational. How do we scale the care that we provide with consistent quality and safety? And how do we leverage technology? So that's really not necessarily about doing new things, but trying to say, how do we, some of the things that I mentioned earlier, which is how do we match the right patients to the right physicians? How do we, if we can actually, physicians today spend 30 to 40% of their time in bookkeeping. I don't yet know of a way to improve that. But if you can get, we today, for instance, probably turn away 30, 40, 50% because of the fact that we cannot accommodate them just in terms of our available capacity. So the more we can have smarter assessment of which patients are highest at risk, which ones have the most serious and most urgent needs, just trying to do that. And if we can improve our ability to service more patients with the right equity, 5, 10, 15, 20% at the scale that we're at, that matters. So I will say that just the theme that I think that we work backwards from is we want to be the world's best in healthcare, but then how do we scale it with consistent quality? And that's where, and where all does technology play a role, and physician throughput, processes, procedures, patient predictions in terms of likelihood of risk, likelihood of sort of something developing into something more serious. All of those are factors where it's not necessarily new, but it's scaling with quality.
Exactly. Like a simple example, if you have a baby today in America, nope, it's very difficult for the healthcare system to figure out how to follow up with you when you go home. Like, speaking from personal experience, and others on this call, may have seen family members go through this, but a very, very common occurrence in the healthcare system is, a woman has a baby. We know our maternal health outcomes are not where they should be as a country. And you look at, well, what could we be doing differently with technology? Well, we could simply call, text, check in on mom and baby, and we don't, right? Why? Because today that would be a very manual process. Today you'd have to have a nurse who'd have to know who to call. They'd have to know, to Rohit's point, who's at high risk and who's not. They'd have to know when to call. They'd have to know what to say. They'd have to know what data is relevant for that patient. And so it's a very simple technology-based intervention, which could be to create large-scale, disseminated, semi-automated communication systems with patients that extend after the episode of an acute care, incident. But that requires infrastructure, that requires technology. I think that's just as exciting as finding a novel feature on a pathology slide. But the framing, again, is about doing something that the doctors today and the care teams today are struggling to do, not not just making them marginally more efficient, so to speak.
I think that's actually exactly right. So a second area where we see, which is not, it's literally just leveraging technology, but our focus ends up being inpatient care, outpatient care. The pandemic forced telehealth, and everything else is not a big part of our footprint today, but should be. So trying to extend it to say, how do you leverage technology for lighter touch, supervision, proactive education, proactive training, proactive reach out, doing that in a way, I mean, there's so many different ways where we can use technology to just make that care just sort of much more, I think it's better for patient experience. It's a lot lighter touch. They don't have to go travel to a facility, which obviously they're only going to do infrequently. And it's much easier for physicians to scale out in terms of taking care of more patients. So absolutely agree. I think I'll just say, logically, leveraging technology to power virtual health is something that is going to happen. And we need to make big pushes on that front.
I'd love to just start talking about a little bit of where are we going? And so on both sides of this, I feel like I have a very foggy sense of this idea that we're moving towards a future where we can take some version of patient characteristics, disease information, demographics, find therapies, sites of care, treatment modalities that are targeted at individuals. What that looks like, Daphne, I'm just curious, what is your vision here?
I think in terms of the where next on the drug discovery side, I'd like to come back to some of the earlier threads and to say that the drug discovery process is a really long and complex one with multiple steps along the way where we oftentimes don't know which path of many, if we're lucky, might lead us to success, where many of the others lead to long and expensive dead ends. And so what I think I see for drug discovery in terms of the use of data is really informing each and every one of those steps with, if you will, a machine learned compass, a set of tools that allow us to figure out much more rapidly and with much greater probability of success which of those paths is likely to be the right one. And that starts with everything from what is the right target that we should go after, and how do we define the patient population in which that target is likely to be efficacious? Can we predict on target adverse effects for intervening in that target in this patient population? Then how do we design molecules much more rapidly and with much greater ability to predict whether they're likely to bind appropriately and modulate the target? And some of the tools that we've seen, like, for example, AlphaFold, that allows us to much more quickly figure out what the protein is and what might be some candidate binding sites on that protein, are all going to both accelerate and de-risk the process of designing designing compounds. As we think about actually going into the clinic, what is the right patient population and how do we measure the success of the drug in a clinical trial? So each of these is going to get better. And when you think about the fact that what we now have is a product of probabilities of success that ends up giving us an aggregate success rate of 5 to 10% in the drug discovery process. There's no other industry that I know of that has a 5 to 10% success rate. I mean, it's such an abysmally low number. If we're able to change each and every one of those steps and move it up, that will potentially give us a very significant uplift on that probability of success, which to my mind is the biggest driver of the this ballooning of drug costs that we've seen, is just that most drugs fail. And so that to me will help address some of the most significant societal costs of therapeutics, is just increasing that probability of success. And then finally, I think as we start to think of engineerable medicines like the ones that, for example, use RNA, I think there's long-term opportunities to really start personalizing. And there's been a lot of discussion about N-of-1 medicines, especially for rare diseases. But I think if we stay within the realm of what is feasible in a much shorter time frame, there's a lot of diseases diseases and a lot of institutions where there's a very rigid protocol. The patient comes in, first you do X. If X doesn't work, then you do Y. And if that doesn't work, you do something else. And that's really unlikely to be the right sequence of events for most patients. Most patients might benefit from some patients might benefit from going directly to Z. And there's currently ways in which we can start to get biomarkers that allow us to guide patient treatment towards things that are more likely to be efficacious. These are fairly limited now, fairly coarse-grained, often based on single-dimensional attributes like maybe a single genetic variant or maybe the level of a certain a certain biomarker in the blood. I think as we are able to extract data from both clinical trials and real world evidence and really be able to come up with a much more adaptive protocol that allows us to go through the right sequence of medicines for patients and avoid fairly significant pain and suffering along the way. And sometimes even patients that by the time you figure out what's right for them, it might be too late. And I think that's an incredible opportunity for us to leverage real world and clinical trial data to improve the delivery of care.
Manita, I know you live on both sides of the world. I'm very curious, your take on the delivery side.
I do think the worlds will hopefully start to come together, and maybe clinical development and clinical trials is kind of the bridge between precision drug discovery and precision drug deployment. And clearly the companion diagnostic regulatory path has been meaningful in that regard in bringing diagnostics into mainstream use by virtue of tethering them directly to a drug and to a physician's ability to prescribe a drug in a particular patient. So I think that's kind of as complicated as the business models around companion diagnostics are. That is in my mind a very exciting place to continue to look and think and tinker and innovate, because whether that's a digital diagnostic in the future or whether it's novel types of patient matching technology or whether it is more traditional diagnostics, to me that does become a very interesting way to bridge, the work that, let's say, Daphne is doing to develop drugs against specific targets and the work that Rohit talked about, which is to figure out which patients would benefit from those drugs in what ways and how do you find them. So that is something that, as controversial as it may be, I love the concept of companion diagnostics, and I think that as a field, we should be thinking about more ways to emulate that paradigm.
And Rohit, would love you to bring us home. Similar question. When I think of kind of the history of healthcare delivery, I think of sort of averages. We build these big care centers that are meant for everybody, not targeted at sort of any particular group. Maybe somebody who has a severe, acute, well-defined illness, really well served. Very curious if you see movement towards providing different entry points for different populations, and what that looks like longer term.
I'll give the low-tech answer, and I give it in the context of healthcare delivery. What we do try to do is be very thoughtful. The stuff that I see from the clinic's perspective is we try to be very thoughtful about sort of providing the right services and the right facilities in the right communities. So we work backwards from understanding a community, understanding the demographics, understanding the services that they need in sort of each regions, and being thoughtful about scaling out sort of the skills, the capacity, and sort of the different service lines, if you will, in each of those regions. So that's the approach that we've generally taken. Obviously, at the scale that we're at, I think that approach generally makes sense, but that's how we think about trying to be sort of as precise as possible, if you will. What gets me excited is the problems are not that hard if we can marry them and have the deep collaboration. So it's kind of marrying the clinical expertise with some technical muscle so that we can actually solve these problems. So that, I think, is and mostly an execution problem, not trying to reinvent the world. I think the second part which gets me excited is, we touched upon it, is we know that over time, patients will access care differently. If you have some ailment, you might start literally with a Google search. Do we have excellent education that's available, and is it accessible? Can it lead you down different potential care paths? A lot of guidance can be given electronically. A lot of guidance can be given in some flavor of lightly supervised healthcare. All of these are problems where I don't yet know what will resonate, what will work well for what ailments. But there's no question in my mind that patients increasingly will engage with healthcare differently. If people in my generation or my parents' generation had a PCP and always had an in-person appointment, it's already different today, and it's going to be more and more different tomorrow. So how do you navigate that journey, for me, is quite exciting. I don't know where it ends up. I don't know what things resonate with patients and what kind of things are amenable to technology versus not. But I think, at least I'm convinced, that it is going to happen, and we need to have the building blocks in place so that we can do it in a way that's safe, that's effective. The opportunity is, it's great for patient experience, it's at a much lower cost, and it's equally effective.
That's perfect.
Thank you.